One of the best parts of my job is getting to play with really expensive premium smartphones, oftentimes days before they go on sale. But if you ask me whether or not I love the idea of paying for all of this stuff, well, the answer is a pretty obvious no. I don't often like spending more than I need to. Samsung gets that, which is why they've created new devices like the Galaxy A52 5G, which packs a pretty great screen, solid performance, a plethora of cameras around back, all for about $500, which is not a ton. You could wind up paying a lot more for a smartphone if you're not careful. The question is a $500 phone these days really worth investing in? Well, before we get to that, I want to make clear this is not a full review. I'm not at home. I don't have access to my full suite of comparison devices, so consider this more of an open-ended conversation about the A52 5G and what it means to buy into a less expensive smartphone. Let's take a closer look. Now, you would naturally expect a $500 smartphone to be rife with compromises, and that is certainly true to an extent. The back of this phone, for example, it's made out of a flat sheet of plastic. Unfortunately, we're not getting any of the fun colors that Samsung showed off in its ostentatious and kind of cringy launch event. We're just getting black here, which is fine if you're into the more subtle look, but I find it does tend to pick up fingerprints pretty quickly. That said, this body is rated IP67 for water and dust resistance, so it should handle a decent amount of beating, but that's not true of the entire phone. The display, while great, and we'll get to that in a second, the cover glass is actually quite malleable, to the extent where I've already put a couple really small nicks in it. Bear in mind, I've been treating this phone with kid gloves basically since I got it. It is brand new, so for little scratches to appear so quickly doesn't really bode well for long-term use. Oh, there's no wireless charging here. That still largely remains a feature Samsung only wants to put in its more expensive smartphones, and charging can take a while. Samsung says the A52 5G supports 25-watt fast charging, but they only gave you a 15-watt charging brick in the box. Now, it's nice that you're getting one anyway, since we are painfully aware that Samsung is removing these things from some of its flagship devices, but long story short, just be ready for a bit of a wait next time you take this thing to a wall outlet. If there is one standout here, it is the screen Samsung chose, a 6.5-inch Infinity O AMOLED display that, to my eyes, honestly looks pretty great for a phone of this price. It's also really smooth if you want it to be. You can ramp up the refresh rate on the display up to 120 Hertz, though that is completely optional. If you'd rather have the battery savings, you can keep things at a relatively eye-friendly 60 Hertz. Not nearly as pretty, but should keep your A52 5G just going a little bit longer. Other than that, there's not a whole lot to complain about. 1080p on a screen this size might not be perfect for everybody. I know some pixel peepers would probably be just a little bit upset by the choice, but bear in mind, again, this is a $500 phone. It's certainly not bad, and it is worth pointing out that even under the harsh Oakland sun, the max brightness on this display makes it perfectly usable outdoors. Now that it's finally getting nice out and people are getting vaccinated, that's going to be more of a concern than it maybe was this time last year, so certainly something to keep in mind. We're also looking at a pretty flexible rear camera setup. We've got 4 sensors back there. Now, I will be completely frank, it's been pretty nice in California so far. So the photos I've taken under broad daylight do look great, and that's generally true of every other smartphone camera. And really, if your lighting is good, you have nothing to worry about. When it finally gets dark and night mode kicks in automatically, you do get generally nice results as well. Now, like I said before, I don't have my full complement of review comparison devices, and I would have loved to test this thing against Google's Pixel 4a, which in my mind is probably the best cheap Android smartphone you could probably buy right now. And that's thanks in large part to its really incredible computational photography chops. Those photos look good and you barely have to do anything. Samsung's image processing has gotten really good, particularly when it comes to night shots. I have taken a few that I'm really proud of, but I'm still not convinced that they've really managed to pull ahead of Google. And if you're more of an iPhone person, I should point out that the iPhone 11 generally does a better job overall, though I think it really kind of boils down to your personal preference. The iPhones these days tend to shoot pretty moody photos. They're a little more contrasty, whereas Samsung, obviously, as always, still skews towards really bright images with a lot of color, a lot of verve, and a lot of vividness. We're also looking at a 12-megapixel ultra-wide camera, which is honestly, it's fine. It's not great. I wouldn't use this often if I could get away with it. And honestly, if you're in any sort of dark situation, you're going to see a lot of noise, but it's there for you anyway. As far as flexibility goes, those are really the two cameras that you're gonna wanna stick with the most often. There is a depth sensor basically just for portraits and using some of Snapchat's filters that are now built into the camera app, which they're not bad, I guess, if you're into that kind of thing. You can take photos of people splashed in fake makeup, or if you really wanted to, there's an out of focus mode that lets you take perfectly casual, not at all contrived images that aren't quite in focus, but you're wearing a nice pair of virtual shades, so it's kind of worth it, maybe not. Oh, and if you happen to be a fan of shooting really, really small things, there is a 5 megapixel macro camera here, which certainly does the job well enough. I spent a little time shooting a tiny bug walking around on the sort of textured grip of my Fuji X-H1, and I gotta say, didn't look too bad. Will I use this in any sort of regular sense? Probably not, but this is Samsung. Their camera setups are generally more focused on the flexibility of the entire package rather than giving you great cameras all the way through, so I can't say I'm surprised. Now, after living with the A52 5G for a couple days, I have to say performance out of the Snapdragon 750G chipset has been more or less respectable. In day-to-day tasks like whipping through websites, installing apps, playing games, I actually ran into very little issue. The times when things did seem to get pretty hinky were not really the ones I expected. The device only has 6 gigs of RAM, and for whatever reason, I think this is most apparent when you're jumping between certain applications. The one example that most immediately springs to mind is if you're watching a video on YouTube and you jump out of it. The natural inclination for YouTube is to just shrink that video window and sort of have it running on top of the rest of Android. But that has caused my phone to sort of lock up a few times for reasons that I can't quite figure out. Maybe it's the RAM, maybe there's some underlying software optimization that's not happening correctly, but there are moments where the A52 5G just doesn't feel as fast as you'd expect out of a $500 phone. And then of course there is the software, which continues to be a very hit or miss proposition. Now, since this is Samsung we're talking about, there is a lot of extra stuff built into One UI, and a lot of it, you know, if you're an Android purist, almost certainly not for you. But if you're someone who's just sort of getting to grips with a new smartphone or don't really have a ton of expectations, you just need something reliable, I think on the whole, Samsung's balance of good software to just sort of bloated cruft sort of works out in Samsung's favor, which I guess means it works out in our favor too. Now, I wish I'd had a little more time to test this, and I will continue to keep living with the A52 5G for a while to really get a sense of what it's capable of. But there are just some things that still, for me at least at this point, remain question marks. Battery life is one of those things. There is a 4,500 milliamp hour battery inside the A52. I've generally been able to get a full day out of it at least, but I'd like to see where that ends. As the name implies, this is also a 5G device, and it plays nice with sub-6 5G networks, although it is clearly not everywhere. I should mention that as I sit here in this backyard, I'm not getting 5G at all, despite getting 5G actually really quite close. This is T-Mobile 5G, it's their nationwide network, and in general it does seem to work pretty well, but I got nothing right now, so we'll see what that's about. One more thing that I would really like to live with a little more, the in-display fingerprint sensor. It's there, it works most of the time, but I'm gonna try re-enrolling my thumbprint a few more times because as it stands, it is a bit of a struggle to get this phone to unlock, and that's just not a fun thing to live with. I've not spent that much time with the A52 5G, but it does seem to have all the makings of a really properly solid mid-range 5G device. But should you buy one? Well, you might want to wait for more coverage from us before you make your decision, but at least as far as my first impressions go, I would probably skip it. And that's not because I'm telling you to go off and buy a Pixel 4a or an iPhone SE. I think Samsung's own biggest competition in this case is Samsung. It doesn't cost that much extra now with the right deals to get a Galaxy S20 Fan Edition. That gets you a much faster processor. It gets you, again, a 120 Hz refresh rate display. It gets you, again, a bevy of cameras, plus the same battery. I think in general, the performance gain is probably gonna be worth it, but we'll see how things pan out once I live with the A52 for just a little bit longer. If you have any thoughts about the way we approached this, whatever this was, or if you want to know anything specific about my experience with the A52 5G, please leave it down in the comments below or email me at v8engadget.com. If you also want to see more of this stuff, like and subscribe, and we'll see you again soon.